Hi. Four of the most important early explorers in Antarctica were Douglas Mawson, Ernest Shackleton, Robert Scott, and Ralph Amundsen. Douglas Mawson was born in England, but at the age of 2 moved to Australia. He was trained as a scientist, and the main reason he went to Antarctica was not really to explore it as such, but to explore the geology and do scientific work there. That was his main reason for going. He went in 1907 to 1909 with Ernest Shackleton on the Nimrod for his first journey. And he then was asked by Robert Scott to go on the Terra Nova expedition, but he turned this down because he wasn't interested in going for the same reasons as Scott. He wanted to go along with Scott on his ship, but be dropped off at a different part of Antarctica and do his own work, and Scott didn't agree to this. It would have been interesting if he had said yes, what the outcome maybe would have been, how that would have changed. Meanwhile, Douglas Mawson did go back to Antarctica in 1912 on his own expedition on the Aurora, and he went mainly again to do scientific work. On that expedition, he went off with Ninnis and Mertz, and they ran into some trouble. Ninnis fell through a crevasse and took one of the sledges with dogs and food supplies, never to be saved from the crevasse. They died there. Mertz and Mawson continued. They had to eat their dogs to survive, but what they didn't know was that the dog livers were toxic, and Mertz got very ill and he ended up dying, and Mawson just made it back to camp. But unfortunately, when he got there, he saw the Aurora leaving. It had waited, but it was time for it to leave, so he had to winter. Luckily, some men were left back in case he came back, and he had to winter, and then the next year they came and picked him up. Mawson ended up dying in 1958 after having gone back to Antarctica in 1929 using aircraft for the first time. So he was he had quite a good career in Antarctica. And out of our 4 explorers I'm talking about, he's the only one who actually didn't die in Antarctica or in the Arctic. That leads us to Ernest Shackleton, who again went on the Nimrod in 1907. But previous to that, Shackleton went in 1901 to 1904 with Robert Scott, and that was on the Discovery voyage. I must say that Shackleton and Scott didn't really have the best of relationships. They sort of differed in the type of people they were and how they handled things. Shackleton ended up getting ill and had to be sent back, so he didn't really succeed in what he had wanted and hoped to do there. Meanwhile, in 1907 he went on the Nimrod expedition, where he got very, very close to the South Pole, but had to turn back in order to survive, which he did. 1914 to 1916 was the Endurance expedition, where he took 27 men. He hoped to be the first one to walk across Antarctica. He never made it. His ship, the Endurance, froze in pack ice, and they held on as long as they could, and finally the ship sunk. And he was left on ice floes with his men. Miraculously, though, they survived. They got into the lifeboats and they set sail, ending up on Elephant Island. As it turned out, Elephant Island wasn't a very hospitable place where they could stay, so Shackleton ended up taking 5 men in the better of the lifeboats, which they reinforced, and he sailed for South Georgia Island, where he knew that there was a whaling station. This was quite a feat for him to get to. It was 800 miles of treacherous seas, and they finally made it. When they got to South Georgia Island, it turned out that they were on the wrong side of the island. There was a huge mountain, but didn't stop Shackleton, just climbed the mountain, minus the proper gear, but made it, and slid the way down and got help and did go back and get all of the men, and not one man died. It was an incredible just feat that they all lived, and that the leadership that Shackleton gave was just so incredibly strong, and he just inspired everybody to sort of get along, and he cared about his men. That leads us now to Raoul Amundsen, who originally began exploring the Arctic and looking for a way through the Northwest Passage. And he first went to Antarctica in the Belgian Antarctic expedition in 1897 to 1899. And then in 1903 to 1906, he did the Northwest Passage expedition in the Arctic. And in 1910, he was going to go back to the Arctic, but he heard that Peary did what he wanted to do first. So he turned around and decided to go for the South Pole instead, which was a surprise for Robert Scott. Amundsen was very well trained for this expedition, and he had brought a good team of dogs and well-trained men. And on his ship, the Fram, they got to Antarctica in 1910, and on December 14th, 1911, Amundsen and his team made it to the South Pole, beating Scott by about 1 month. And then he turned around and went back. Amundsen then continued on his quest in the North Pole. He ended up dying in an airplane crash on a rescue mission. So he died during his work. That was in 1928. Then we have Robert Scott. Robert Scott was trained as a naval officer, and he was a good leader, different than Shackleton, but a good leader, a good man, caring person. And in 1901 to 1904, he led the Discovery Expedition, and that's where Shackleton was also along on that expedition. There was a lot of scientific work done during that expedition, and that led us to 1910 to 1912, the Terra Nova Expedition. And along with the scientific work, Robert Scott thought it would be quite good to be the first person to the South Pole as well. At first, he had no idea that Amundsen would be joining the race. He thought that it was a solo race, and he wasn't too happy when he found out, and he especially wasn't happy when he reached the pole after working very hard to get there. And that was January 17th, 1912. And he saw the note from Amundsen. He was very sad about the fact that he didn't make it first, but he did care about getting back and bringing back all of the scientific collection that he had along the way, fossils and other things. Some of the things that he had gathered had been taken back earlier with the team that did not continue to the South Pole with him. And these things can be seen now in the Scott Polar Museum and other museums around the world. Robert Scott finally succumbed to very unfortunate, horrible weather that year. He was very close to his hut, very close to safety, but just couldn't get there, couldn't make it. And his men sort of just lost hope. They knew, they tried, they knew that they weren't going to make it. And March 29th, 1912 was the last entry in the diary with Robert Scott, and he had put up a valiant effort, and I think he's someone who was incredibly courageous, and just, it was an unfortunate event what happened. Thank you.